Hello, I'm Garry Stevens, and welcome to the History in the Bible podcast. All the history, in all the books, in all the Bibles. Episode 1.57, Modern Debates, End of an Era. In the last episode of the History in the Bible, I covered the debates that scholars today have about the exile of the Judeans in Babylon, how many marched, and how many stayed behind. I also discussed the last days of the prophet Jeremiah, and the short and sad administration of Gedaliah, the native governor appointed by Babylon to rule over the tiny province of Judah. And at that point, I will finish this series. Why end Series 1 at such an odd place, at the beginning of the exile? Why not finish my first series with the rest of the Old Testament, the Jewish Tanakh? These last books contain the histories of Ezra and Nehemiah. They also include the two major prophets of Ezekiel and Daniel, and a few minor ones, Malachi, Haggai, Zechariah, Joel, Obadiah, and Jonah. To round off the lot, we have the books of Job, Ruth, and Esther. And that's it for the Protestant Old Testament and the Jewish Tanakh. Catholics add the books of Baruch, Sirach, Tobit, Judith, and the first two books of Maccabees. To that, the Orthodox add 1st Esdras and the 3rd and 4th books of Maccabees. The Ethiopian Orthodox throw in the books of Enoch, Jubilees, 2nd Ezra, and the 3 books of Maccabean. Jews hold that the last holy text was the book that the prophet Malachi wrote in about 450 BC during the Persian period. No great work was then fashioned until the legal digest, the Mishnah, around 200 AD, at the height of the Roman Empire 650 years later. The Christian division into Old and New Testaments pretends that nothing happened between Malachi and the letters of Paul, a period of 500 years. Both traditions have utterly obliterated the rich religious literature that flooded forth in the period between the return and St. Paul. This is the Second Temple period, named after the temple that Ezra and Nehemiah and the exiles from Babylon built to replace Solomon's temple. As we now know, the period after the return from Babylon spawned a luxuriant Jewish literature, dozens and dozens of books with radically new ideas. In my collections of these works, I count over 120 documents, varying from entire books to mere quotations preserved by later authors. Over 3,000 pages in English translation. 3,000 pages. The rabbis who made the Mishnah pretended that these books never existed. They were only preserved by Christians through the period of late antiquity and the Middle Ages. These works were seminal influences on Christianity. After the Church of the Roman Empire settled on a firm canon of approved works, it did its best to suppress, or at least ignore, other volumes that claimed antiquity. The effort was only partly successful. Many survived in Christian communities on the fringes of the Roman Empire or beyond its dominion. The Jewish tradition universally regarded them as Christian forgeries. That position was blown out of the water when portions from these many documents were found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, indisputably written before Jesus was born. The books written after the exile, that Jews and Christians include in their Bibles, have much more in common with this Second Temple literature than with all the books written before the exile. A great example is the book of Daniel. After much argument, rabbinic scholars squeaked it into the canon. If you think of the book of Daniel as the last great Old Testament prophet, it is a very peculiar beast indeed. If you think of it as the earliest of the Second Temple books, it is but the start of a long line of religious thinking. Because of the continuity between the final books of the Hebrew canon written after the exile and the Second Temple literature, it makes much more sense to me to finish my first series with the beginning of the exile. I also think that to end my first series with the last books of the Old Testament would be to disguise the great rupture that fractured the ancient religion of the Israelites. After the return from Babylon, the religion of the Jews followed paths that the patriarchs, or Moses, or David, or the kings, or most of the prophets could not, would not have understood. So let's assess the nature of the Judean religion at the time of the destruction of the kingdom of Judah. Now, to many people, such a conceit is unnecessary and ridiculous. Modern Judaism portrays itself as one unbroken tapestry of belief and law from the time that God tapped Abraham on the shoulder. God later expounded on his laws to Moses. Some of these laws Moses wrote down in the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah. Jews hold that many others were passed down orally to a class of rabbinical scholars, a guild that had existed from the time of Moses. These oral traditions were first committed to writing in the Mishnah. Scholars since the late 19th century have unwoven that tapestry. The modern consensus is that the religion of the Hebrews has evolved through 4 distinct phases. The first phase could be called the patriarchal religion, a modified form of Canaanite religion. This is preserved in the Bible in the stories of those writers that scholars call the J and E sources. The second phase is that of biblical religion, the religion that completely dominates the Old Testament. This was constructed by the school of scribes that scholars call the Deuteronomist, or D source, the author of the books of Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. This is the religion of the monarchy of David, of the southern kingdom of Judah. A healthy dose of material was also contributed by the priestly school, the so-called P source. Now, for a refresher about the Deuteronomist and the E, J, and P authors, you can always catch up with episode 1.7, Writing the Pentateuch. The third phase in the development of the Hebrew religion was the lush period of invention that flowered in the Second Temple period, between the return from Babylon and the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem by the Romans in 70 AD. In this period we find the Essenes, the Pharisees, and the little-known Sadducees. We see the rise of Jewish mysticism and those who believed that the end of times was upon them. We find Jews who wanted to rewrite the entire book of Genesis and reconstruct the sacred calendar of the year. We find Jews who supported the state and those who worked for its destruction. Jews who thought the temple the holiest place on earth, and those who held it to be a sink of corruption. A whole host of sects and communities. In the fourth and final phase of the Hebrew religion, it sundered into 2 daughters, Christianity and Rabbinical Judaism. Christianity incorporated many of the ideas in the books of the Second Temple period, while pretending they had no influence at all. Most important of these notions were that of a heavenly Messiah, a suffering servant, an imminent end of the world, and a mystical union with God after death. The Church co-opted the literary devices of historical narrative and prophetic discourse that were the core of the Tanakh. And Christianity also inherited the fissile, fractious, and frangible failures of Second Temple Judaism. The religion of the rabbis, on the other hand, struggled to reconstruct a temple-based religion that had no temple. Every idea that the Christians absorbed from the Second Temple books, the rabbis rejected utterly. The Messiah was an earthly warrior king who would restore Judah's independence. Jews could not become one with God. Man and God were utterly different. The idea was ludicrous. When the Christians claimed history and prophecy as their own, the rabbis reconstructed their religion as one based on law. Now, let's dig into the detail. And I'll start by describing the oldest stratum preserved in the Bible, the patriarchal religion. This is the religion of Abraham and Isaac and Israel and the judges. The Hebrews worshipped the same gods as their neighbours. The father god, El or Ale, the bull, who presided over a divine assembly. God is often called El in the Bible. Then came El's wife Asherah, and the young storm god Baal, amongst many others. The Hebrews had a particular preference for the storm god Yahweh, who they probably picked up from their southern neighbours in Midian and Edom, as I blathered on about in episode 1.5, The Names of God. But Yahweh was just one god in the divine assembly. When Moses' brother Aaron made a calf, really a bull, he celebrated El, just as the northern kingdom did when it made bulls at the great shrines to El at Bethel and Dan. Abundant evidence from the Bible itself depicts a people worshipping a multiplicity of gods. The prophets Hosea and Elijah say so, let alone the endless complaints about backsliding in the Book of Kings. Even Solomon, greatest of kings, was a polytheist. The Psalms are full of references to the Canaanite assembly of gods, and the classic Canaanite myths of struggles with the monsters of the oceans, as I discussed in episode 1.37, David and the Psalms. The Bible talks endlessly about the religious rituals of the nation. The Torah contains 5 separate lists of the great annual festivals. The festivals of unleavened bread, later merged with Passover, and the festival of weeks in the spring, and tabernacles or booths in the autumn, seem to be the oldest. All are agricultural. The Hebrews also had a monthly new moon festival, which today is barely noticed in Judaism. Now, one festival they did not have was a New Year's festival. That would make them unique in the ancient world. But the Bible rarely mentions private practice, what people did at home, day by day or week by week. As far as we can tell, God was worshipped mainly through sacrifices and through pilgrimages to the shrines, the high places. Families would erect shrines on hills with an altar to slaughter animals, and perhaps with a typically Canaanite phallic pillar representing El, and a wooden totem symbolizing his wife Asherah. These shrines were sanctified by the practice of the patriarchs: Abraham at Shechem, Bethel, Beersheba, and Mamre; Isaac at Beersheba; and Israel at Bethel and Shechem. Apart from this, we know very little about private practices, save for cults of the dead. Archaeological investigations suggest that a cult of the dead was very much part of Hebrew practice, just as it was for their Canaanite neighbours. The burial sites we have found contain ceramic vessels, jewellery, personal items. The presence of bowls, store jars, plates, and cooking pots indicate offerings to the dead. The religion of the patriarchs and the judges is virtually indistinguishable from that of the Canaanites. The patriarchal religion was the usual polytheistic mishmash, although it did focus on Yahweh, and it did disdain from depicting Yahweh in any sort of human form. Over time, Yahweh absorbed the personalities of El and Baal. From the plentiful statues we have found from the Two Kingdoms period, the goddess Asherah was worshipped at least until the last decades of the Judean monarchy. The second phase of the evolution of the Judean faith is what I've called biblical religion. Biblical religion evolved during the time of the monarchy, from about 1000 BC to 600 BC. It's a complex beast. The basic theme of the biblical account is that the Hebrews worshipped Yahweh alone from the time of Abraham. The backsliding people struggled to resist the polytheistic beguilements of their Canaanite neighbours for their entire history. But, the Bible says, the people were really Yahwists in their hearts, like your vegetarian friends who have fish and chips every so often, because that doesn't count. The Bible holds that the Hebrews were really monotheists at heart. But the Old Testament has a lot of difficulty selling that idea with a straight face. Of the 40 kings of Israel and Judah, only 6 are described as zealous devotees of Yahweh: Kings Saul, David, Jehoshaphat, Uzziah, Hezekiah, and Josiah. All the others worship many gods. That does not sound like a people of relapsing Yahweh worshippers. That sounds like a people of natural polytheists. The historical reality seems to be this: the old religion of the Hebrews was Canaanite polytheism, with Yahweh as a local hero. In the northern kingdom of Israel, the house of Omri's support of the god Baal incited the violent opposition of the prophets Elijah and Elisha, the local heroes' most dedicated devotees. I babbled on about them in episode 1.44, The House of Omri. They supported a military coup against the house of Omri, led by one Jehu. But Yahvism never really took root in Israel, as the northern prophets Amos and Hosea attest a century later. The Israelites were polytheists until the end. The Yahweh-only party fled south to the kingdom of Judah after the Assyrian destruction of Israel, where their monomania found a happier reception. Biblical religion was thus really northern Israelite in origin. That is why the name of the community that accepted biblical religion was to remain Israel, long after the demise of the kingdom of that name. Over the next century, the Yahvists formed alliances with a loose confederation of priests, prophets, and royal officials. Today, scholars call them the Deuteronomists. They created a new and much more sophisticated belief system founded on the old patriarchal faith. First, they did some basic house cleaning. They ditched all the sub-gods and demons of the Canaanites, leaving only a few fossil relics in the Bible, such as the scapegoat story of the demon Azazel, mentioned in Leviticus 16. They demoted Yahweh's fellow Canaanite gods to angels. They were especially keen to remove all the sexual stories of divine copulations. Of these tales, the only remnant left in the Bible is the enigmatic story of the Nephilim, told in Genesis 6. I got into that one in episode 1.9, Genesis 2, Tales of the Flood. The Deuteronomists were stuck with the ancient tales of the J and E sources that we find in Genesis and Exodus, tales of the old patriarchal religion. The Deuteronomists thought these stories vulgar. They instead constructed a transcendent God to replace the earthy avuncular deity of those earlier authors. God, they said, would no longer communicate with his people in person. If the Deuteronomists were keen to cleanse the literature of the old religion, they did nothing to change the images, the iconography. Moses' tent of meeting and Solomon's temple made extensive use of typical Canaanite and Babylonian imagery. Second, the Deuteronomists created a whole new legal framework to define the relationship between the Hebrews and their God. They based this on Assyrian vassal treaties. If you want all the details, have a listen to episode 1.21, Moses Farewells His People. They held that God and the nation had freely entered into a legal covenant at Mount Sinai. The people bound themselves and all their descendants unto the end of time to keep Yahweh's laws and to do his will. In return, Yahweh gave his people the land of Canaan and his protection, using exactly the same language that the Assyrians used in their treaties. The Hebrews were commanded to not only fear and obey Yahweh, but to love him with absolute devotion. Sometime before the exile, the Deuteronomists refined this legal theory. They constructed the royal Zion theology, the concept that Yahweh had promised the kingship of Judah to the house of King David in perpetuity. I covered that in episode 1.34, David Triumphant. This novel theory of kingly supremacy was imported from Egypt and Phoenicia. The patriarchal religion had taken for granted God's intimacy with his people. From the time of the late monarchy, only the king could talk to God. Yahweh was no longer everyone's God, but the king's God, whose grace and favour flowed down from the king to the people. And as the king's God, Yahweh's primary contract and obligation was with the king's city, and the king's temple. Then, third, the Deuteronomists created a canon of literature, a literature that they averred was central to the religion. They also insisted that these texts were immutable. These were firsts for the Middle East. No one had ever argued before that to be a true devotee of one's local God, you must accept without question the written stories of that religion. After all, who could read? Fourth and finally, the Deuteronomists constructed a God who constantly acted in the history of his people. He was not a God whose stories of old you heard from the elders, the almost forgotten stories of the great sea monsters. Yahweh acted now, today. There are two other elements thrown into the pot of the religion of the Judeans, as it was just before the exile. First, of course, the prophets. Court prophets, intermediaries between the divine and the local prince, were all over the place in the Middle East. Like the writers of astrology columns today, they delivered vague soothsaying to whomever would listen. Biblical religion raised these commonplace messengers to a whole new level. The prophets of the Bible became important critics of the king and state. The Deuteronomists were ambivalent about the prophets, but they had no alternative but to accept their popular centuries-old works into the canon. They did their best to say that no more prophets were welcome. The greatest prophetic revelation was to Moses at Sinai. Who really needed any more? The final component, biblical religion, was provided by the priests of the tribe of Levi. They were the authors of the peace source that I mentioned earlier. The peace source is fixated on the proper ways to observe the worship of God, which means the proper ways to sacrifice. To worship was to sacrifice. In the patriarchal religion, the head of each family sacrificed. Now only the priests could. We have no record that the Israelites prayed at any point in their sacrificial worship. To the contrary, the sacrifices were conducted in silence. One major debate is over Hebrew beliefs about the afterlife. There are few references to the afterlife in the Old Testament. The Bible goes out of its way to discourage discussion, oscillating between denial of the possibility and acceptance of a dismal world of shades, Sheol. The name Sheol itself is enigmatic. It does not appear in any of the Semitic languages related to Hebrew. Now, the Bible never criticises another religion for believing in an afterlife. The issue is simply not of interest to the biblical authors. Why this silence on such a common religious concern? Belief in an afterlife was universal in Mesopotamia and Egypt. There are just enough tantalising passages to confuse the issue, such as King Saul's summoning of Samuel, that I mentioned in episode 1.33, From Bandit to King. Where other religions were preoccupied with the afterlife, biblical religion was obsessed with purity. The priests were preoccupied with the defiling nature of menstruation, skin diseases, corpses, bones, and the grave. This fixation stands out in contrast to the surrounding cultures. It may indeed be a reflection of an attempt to combat cults of the dead. It would have been in the priest's interest to suppress such cults, which did not require a priest and brought no income to the priesthood. The priests promote the opposite idea. The only legitimate avenue to God is through them. And such was the religion of the Judeans, just before the Babylonian conquest and exile. I have some reflections on what I have learnt making this first series. I have been disturbed by the pervasive belittlement of women that runs through the Old Testament. Apologists will point to the exaltation of the matriarchs, such as Sarah and Rachel, or the depiction of Sophia, wisdom, as a female principle in the Psalms and Proverbs. But these are rare high points in a text that time and again divides women into four categories: infant girls, wives, widows, and harlots. The Old Testament refers to harlots and harlotry over 100 times. In the Old Testament, the worst crime is not murder, but harlotry. I have also been impressed by just how young the critical and archaeological study of the Bible is. For centuries, nay millennia, both Jewish and Christian scholars followed the same sterile and uncritical paths. Critical scholars and archaeologists only gained access to the lands of the Ottoman Empire in the late 18th century. Over the course of the 19th century, they decoded the ancient languages of Egypt and Mesopotamia and recovered artefacts from the mighty empires of Assyria and Babylon, heretofore only known from the Bible. By 1900, they had constructed a rough history of ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt, a history that had been lost for millennia. The monuments of Canaan were less impressive than those of Mesopotamia and Egypt. There were no imperial languages to decipher. Early excavations in Jerusalem excited local Jewish opposition and scandal in Europe. To this day, archaeologists in Israel face the same sort of objections. Serious work only began in the last decade of the 19th century. Think about that. Scientific research of ancient Palestine is little more than a century old. For the next 60 years, the archaeological digs were largely conducted and funded by American Protestant evangelicals. By 1960, a firm consensus had emerged that the history told in the Bible was reliable and accurate. I was astonished to discover how quickly that consensus collapsed. The men who first exploded the cosy unanimity were the first of the group I call the modernists. They denied that the Bible was the ultimate arbiter, and that its stories were reliable. They argued that the potsherds had priority over the prophets. They started by observing the peculiar bias of biblical archaeology. They noted that biblical archaeologists were trained in biblical studies departments, not in archaeology departments. These diligent diggers in the Holy Land had always been considered as idiosyncratic by the wider archaeological community. Their primary goal was illuminating a religious text, not independently describing culture and its development. The very name of the discipline, biblical archaeology, declaimed its program. Imagine if the archaeology of Britain was known as Arthurian archaeology, and it was dedicated to unearthing Camelot. Biblical archaeologists had hunted for the palaces of David and the monuments of Solomon. They made no attempt at the sort of systematic, large-scale archaeological surveys that were commonplace in other countries. Until the 1967 war, only the large Canaanite cities had been excavated: Bethel, Jericho, Lachish, Hatzor. No one had even thought of conducting surveys in the Central Highlands. When the diggers finally got there, they uncovered the origins of the ancient Israelites. To find out more, check out episodes 1.4, Recovering Ancient Israel, and 1.6, Canaan of the Patriarchs. Since the 1970s, the archaeologists of the Levant have divided into hostile camps. They spend their time hurling insults at each other when they are not at their digs. A diminishing, but still significant number, still hold to the accuracy of the biblical accounts. In this podcast, I followed their opponents, the modernists. The intellectual debate between the two is rancorous, but it's also exciting. One thing I have learned is just how uncertain our knowledge and theories are. At any time, a new find may overturn facts regarded as rock solid for a century. Who knows what's out there, waiting to be dug up? To wrap up, I want to thank my main academic sources. The editors of the Jewish Study Bible have fashioned a wonderful and exhaustive commentary on the English translation of the Tanakh text, made by the Jewish Publication Society. The insights of Professor Christine Hayes of Yale University have been invaluable. Rabbi Everett Fox's translation of the Old Testament, known as the Schocken Bible, was a revelation. And the Oxford Encyclopedia of the books of the Bible has been my bedrock. In the next series of the History in the Bible, I chronicle the history of the Jews from the exile through their time as a small province under the Persian, Greek, and Roman empires, and their brief moment of independence under the bloody Maccabean kings. Then I will get my teeth into the New Testament and the first century of Christianity. At long last, I will explore all the Gospels, the book of Acts, and all the letters in depth, discussing how they present the story of John the Baptist, the disciples, the life, death, and resurrection and ascension of Jesus, and the missions and the life of Paul and Peter. I'll present all that the latest scholarship has to say about the very earliest church, and the conflicts between Peter, James the Just, and Paul. I have 150 years of scholarship to cover, so it may take a while. I'll also explore the many, many books that never made it into any Bible. As ever, for a bibliography, show notes, maps, charts, and diagrams, check out my website, www.historyinthebible.com. Thanks for listening. And now, let me regale you with a new opening theme for Series 2. I'll see you next time. So it's goodbye from Garry Stevens. Until I see you next time in the second series of the History in the Bible podcast. More of the history, in more of the books, in all the Bibles.